Hello guys, Genshin DPS Calc here. Today, we are going to talk about Ganyu. People often describe Ganyu as the strongest main DPS in Genshin Impact. But, is she really the strongest though? How much is her DPS actually? Well, let's find out. In this video, we'll be calculating Ganyu's DPS using two different types of team, the freeze team and the melt team. And to make it fair to the other characters that I've calculated their DPS before, I will use the same baseline substats, which consists of 20 crit substats across 5 artifacts, and I will include only one basic buff for her DPS calculation. For example, in my previous Hu Tao DPS calculation video, I only used Xing Qiu as her vaporize buff, and in my Ito video, I used only a Geo Resonance for his buff. So in this video, I will only use Cryo Resonance for the freeze team buff, and I will only use Melt Reaction for the melt team buff. But don't worry, I will also show you Ganyu's maximum DPS potential by including all the common buffs for both freeze team and the melt team later. Now, before we talk about how Ganyu freeze team and melt team work, let's understand how her charge attack, elemental skill, and her elemental burst work. Her charge attack consists of 2 levels, and it's always recommended to shoot the arrow at level 2, since it can deal powerful and AoE cryo damage in addition to the first normal charge attack damage. Her passive talent also increases her charge attack crit rate by 20%. This is why you never want Ganyu to have more than 80% crit rate. Her elemental skill creates a cryo flower which deals AoE cryo damage at cast, and deals another AoE cryo damage at its end of its duration. It also taunts the enemies nearby, so she can shoot the enemies safely from the distance. Her elemental burst will cause ice shards falling from the sky, and dealing AoE cryo damage. There are 2 types of ice shards that will fall from the sky. One is the shards that will randomly fall and hit whichever unlucky enemies below it, and the other are the shards that will always fall on top of the enemies at fixed interval. If you count carefully, there will be at least 10 shards that will fall on top of every enemy inside Ganyu's elemental burst AoE range. And since each of the shards deals AoE cryo damage, this means if there are 2 enemies stand close to each other, both of them will get hit by each of the shards, doubling the total amount of damage dealt to each of them. So by freezing and grouping the enemies together, Ganyu's elemental burst can do so much damage in addition to her charge attacks. That is the basic idea of a Ganyu freeze team. But if there's only one single enemy, or big enemies that are far apart, or heavy enemies that cannot be grouped, that method won't work at all, meaning her elemental burst damage will only be just around 10 to 12 shards damage. In this video, I will be calculating her DPS based on the assumption that we are facing bosses or heavy enemies that cannot be grouped, just like most enemies in the Abyss, so I will not be doubling, tripling, or quadrupling her burst damage number. With that out of the way, let's look at how my Ganyu freeze team works, and we'll calculate the DPS after that. I will also make a separate video guide explaining about my Ganyu freeze team later. In the demonstration we just saw, I found that my Ganyu cast her elemental skill 4 times, elemental burst 2 times, and her charge attack 7 times in the duration of 52 seconds. Using our DPS calculator, I can simulate her DPS using a Blizzard Strayer set, an R1 Amos bow, and a cryo resonance support. And her basic DPS at talents level 10 is 9.97k. And if I include the buffs from the Viridescent Resistance Shred, and the elemental damage bonus from Kazuha's passive, her maximum DPS is actually 14.67k. Right now, you might be surprised at how low her DPS numbers are, compared to what you usually saw on YouTube thumbnails. But don't get confused with damage per screenshot and real gameplay damage per second. Her charge attack requires you to wait for at least 2 seconds before it can deal damage. And you have 3 other support characters that need to be played beside herself too. So in a real gameplay scenario, Ganyu will not be able to continuously deal damage using her powerful charge shots, thus lowers her true DPS significantly. Now let's move on and look at my Ganyu Melt team performance and calculate their DPS. I'll also make a separate video guide explaining about my Ganyu Melt team later. In the demonstration we just saw, I found that my Ganyu did a total of 11 charge shots, in which 2 of them was not melted. And according to our calculator, her basic DPS using a Wanderer's Troop set and an R1 Amos bow is 10.10k DPS without including all other buffs except for the melt reaction itself. If I include all other buffs such as Bennett's buff, the Pyro Resonance, Zhongli's Shield Resistance Shred, and the Zhongli's Pillar's Millilith's effect, her DPS is now increased to 17.12k DPS. That is the maximum DPS my Ganyu can deal in a melt team. For comparison, here are the DPS chart of other characters that I have calculated previously using their signature weapons. Now that we know all her DPS numbers and comparison, should you pull for Ganyu? The short answer from me is yes. She is a versatile main DPS, can both clear the abyss, and be used in the exploration conveniently, and she is a bow user, which is important to shoot flying enemies, or enemies that are unreachable using melee characters. A bow user is practically essential in every team comp. The long answer though, it depends on what other characters you currently have. Ganyu shines in both freeze teams and melt teams, which both require specific characters to make it work. There are many variations of freeze teams and they usually involve around Mona or Kokomi, Venti or Sucrose or Kazuha, and Diona or Ayaka. For melt teams, usually they involve around Zhongli, Diona, or Xinyan as her shielder, and Xiangling as the irreplaceable pyro applicator, and Bennett as her damage booster. You can also use Xinyan as both her shielder and pyro applicator, if you don't have Zhongli or Diona, or you just want to free them up. But she will not perform as good as Zhongli and Xiangling combo. Ganyu can also be difficult to play on mobile devices, since she requires you to aim. And monsters are now becoming more and more mobile in every patch. Now as always, I will show you her complete weapon DPS chart for both freeze team and melt team. And while you're here, Please subscribe to my channel if you want more DPS calculation videos like this, and please like the video to help my channel grow. Thank you.